If we are now moving away from what I would consider a self-defeating neoliberal model of no economic planning, no state intervention, it is because the West has found itself to be unable to compete with China and China's industrial planning and state-led economy. Hello to China Academy and to all the viewers. I am Lorenzo Marsili. I'm a political philosopher, a journalist, and a social start-upper. So, theory and practice, hopefully our interview will keep both sides together. We come from 2 centuries of European and Western domination over the world. That historical phase has now ended. My take is that we risk entering into a phase of low-intensity global civil war, where the lack of a central hegemon, the decline or collapse of American Western hegemony, leads to a multipolarity that is understood as conflict and struggle, and the attempt of the reasonable people in the world should be to limit that conflict and that struggle, for instance, in the wars that you mentioned in Ukraine and Gaza, and not escalate into a general war. This is not a very pleasant prospect. It is not the world I want to live in. I don't think it's a world we necessarily have to live in. But to jump out of a 20 years of low-intensity global conflict, we need to have the maturity to respect each other's differences, not to want to impose our system onto the other, but to understand what unites us, what are the common interests of humankind. 2 paths open up in front of us. One path is that of a world of multipolar competition and strife, possibly even war, a world of nationalism, and a world where the common interest of humanity is not made. The other path is one where the multiplicity that is now liberated in our world, the autonomy, the independence of China, of India, of Latin America, of African countries, of Europe, come together with full respect for each other's diversity, systemic diversity, political diversity, ideological diversity. I think Europe and China have the potentials of working together for the benefit of humanity. I actually think that we share the same continent. Geologically and historically, the Eurasian space is a single continent. It is so geologically, it is so historically, because both our histories have been defined by nomadic tribes roaming Central Asia between Europe and China. And so this commonality, also the fact that Europe has a historical mind very similar to that of China, has a civilizational history that is comparable to that of China, I think provide the basis for deep mutual understanding. Unfortunately, recently, it has become more difficult to act on that similarity and that civilizational affinity between the 2 spaces. And to be quite blunt, the near-term reason for that is the war in Ukraine. There is a sense in Europe that our continent has been invaded, at least a part of our continent has been invaded, and this has created deep resentment. It has led to economic policies such as increasing trade tensions and trade sanctions, and it has led to a country such as Italy leaving the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it would be a mistake to think that Europe is simply in the hands of the United States and it's being forced to turn away from China by the United States. It is true that in the last few years, Europe has moved closer to the United States policy on China, and that is the outcome of a certain European disappointment with China's actions in the world in the context of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. That aside, I think Europe has the duty to conduct an independent industrial policy. I think the rediscovery of industrial policy in the West is a positive development, and one that is made in China in many respects. If we are now moving away from what I would consider a self-defeating neoliberal model of no economic planning, no state intervention, it is because the West has found itself to be unable to compete with China and China's industrial planning and state-led economy. I think it's important that the subsidies are seen as an attempt of Europe to copy China's model. China has rightly, in my opinion, subsidized its own industries, its own green technology industry, its own artificial intelligence and digital technology industry. I think it has done very well. I think China has done a service to its own economy and to the world by creating such a productive capacity in clean technologies and green technology. Europe is now doing the same. What would not work is a system where only one side can subsidize and the other side follows obsolete neoliberal principles of no state intervention into the economy. So I think China has done a service to the world by showing that the state is an important component of economic development. And Europe, coming from 2 or 3 decades of deregulation, free market fundamentalism, is now learning to redo industrial policy once again. And so those subsidies, I think, should be seen the way that China's policy on having an equal share of ownership in car production 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. If European companies wanted to invest in China, they had to make sure that they had a 50-50 partnership with a local company. The reason for that was that the local company would acquire the technology and then develop an autonomous capacity to produce high technology goods without continuing to import them from Europe. I think that's good. I think China did very well to do such a policy. And I think Europe now, being less technologically advanced on electric vehicles or solar panels, is doing the same. And I think that's fine. So I invite you to see those subsidies as Europe playing catch-up to China's own policy of industrial planning and industrial development. There are many divisions. In the case of car subsidies, the division is very simple. German car companies produce very many cars in China, which they then export from China into the European market. German car companies are not only afraid of China retaliating and reducing the sales of Volkswagen cars in China, they are afraid that there will be an economic loss because they themselves have to pay duty on the vehicles that they produce in China for the European market. What can I say? I am sorry for the German car makers who produce cars in China for the European market. They should relocalize production to Europe and produce cars in Europe. The same I would say to Chinese car producers. There is quite a lot of capacity in Europe to produce cars. I think it would be very nice to see a multiplication of Chinese companies producing Chinese cars in Europe, the way that you have Tesla producing Teslas here in China. All the Teslas that you see on the streets are produced here with Chinese workers. It's investment into the country that Tesla is making. And I think this reciprocity is a positive win-win scenario that we need to work towards. Then Europe is divided in a more general sense between its nation states and within them on China policy. Some countries would like to have a more autonomous policy toward China from the United States. Some countries are afraid that an autonomous policy from the United States would leave Europe alone and would leave Europe at the mercy of potential economic or even military aggression, and the United States safety umbrella, so to speak, but what needs to be maintained. I think that's fine. I think Europe also has an easier time to process the end of Western or American hegemony, because we have seen empires come and go in the thousands of years of history. I'm from Rome, but the Roman Empire has actually occupied and conquered the civilization that I associate with, which is the Etruscan civilization, which preceded even the Roman Empire. And I think this historical mindset makes it quite easy for Europeans to understand that hegemonies are plural, they come and go, and a world where no one has a central role is a world that can work just fine. In fact, better than a world where only one country calls the shots. Something I find always fascinating when I come to China is that my Chinese friends, when I provocatively ask them the question as to whether China wants to replace the United States as the world leader, all of them answer that China has no such aspirations because hegemony and unipolarity is not embedded in Chinese history and civilization. The system of Tiansha, even the tribute system, was certainly centered on China as the relatively hierarchical, more important and powerful country, but was not a system of domination or colonization of China towards the other countries. This has certainly affinities with the way that Europe sees the world today. Europe is constructing itself as a union that tries to move beyond nationalism and to move beyond the tragedy history of European nations fighting one against the other for control over the whole world. So in theory, or at least in rhetoric, there seems to be a certain multilateral or multipolar affinity between Europe and China, more so than perhaps you would find between the US and China. Is this being acted upon politically, intellectually, culturally? I think not. So for instance, I think, if I can be a little bit provocative, I think China has really underestimated the existential importance of the war in Ukraine for the European mind. And I think Europe underestimates certain Chinese sensitivities around border disputes, for example, that we don't have a sufficient awareness of to truly understand. And so rebuilding, or rather building, this reciprocal knowledge of our contemporary mindset, I think it's a precondition for us doing work together. Then is that enough? Probably not. We also need real policy to follow, but let's at least start with having a real dialogue. As you know, Europe is not one country, it's a union of 27 member states. But my hope is that out of this multiplicity and cacophony, some sense is made, and that Europe develops a policy towards China that is firm on its own interests, whether they are geopolitical or economic, but very ready to follow any opening that China demonstrates and to reciprocate any step towards greater collaboration, greater vicinity between Europe and China. So I would like a firm but very welcoming Europe, ready to jump at the opportunity of deeper integration with China.